Okay, hi Luffy, how you doing? Okay, so let's just dive right into this. All right. I've pretty much at this point mapped out the entirety of the One Piece story. I mean, from what happened in the last chapters, spoilers and all that stuff, it seems pretty clear to me the path that Oda wants to take from here on out. Okay, so Luffy is now in his new form. He's in his Gear 5th, his awakening, right? So, you know, we're going to probably have like 2, 3, 4 more chapters of his fight with Kaido, you know, to sort of wrap that up. Okay, now, you want to think at that point, you know, they're going to leave Wano, they're going to go to Elbaf, you know, maybe Lodestar, eventually Laugh Tale, find the One Piece. Oh, no, 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 no. We're going to the next level with this, okay? Luffy's reached Gear 5th. You heard what Luffy said, ladies and gentlemen. Luffy said, you know, this is my peak. This is the greatest. This is my ultimate. This is Gear 5th, okay? Which means he's capable of things beyond your wildest imagination, all right? So the first thing Luffy's going to do, and I know this is going to sound crazy, but after defeating Kaido, he's going to reach up and grab the moon. Yeah, he's going to grab the moon, and then he's going to slingshot up to the moon. Eneru's going to be up there. He's going to be a little confused, but it doesn't matter because Luffy's not going to stay on the moon for long. Luffy is then going to proceed to grab planets and slingshot around the entire cosmos, so he will not only be king of the pirates, he will become king of the universe! Not to be confused with the Masters of the Universe, although Luffy versus He-Man, that's a nice crossover battle idea. Let me know who you think would win in the comments section. That's how it ends right there. Okay, so, you know, that was an intro. I didn't really know where it was going, and that's fitting, because I don't really know where this video is going. Usually, when I do sit down to make a video, at least I have a little bit of an idea of the main focus of said video. This one, I couldn't actually, because there's so much crap going on at once, I couldn't actually decide on, like, okay, this is the main topic of the video, so it's gonna be scattershotted as hell, but let's just go. Alright, first thing I have written down here is, how did Luffy activate Gear 5th? Like, what was the exact impetus for him, you know, going into Gear 5th? You might want to say that it was like Luffy getting struck by Kaido, right? You know, they have the big epic clash. Luffy's in Gear 4th. Kaido's in his homicidal drunk form. You know, it's like, over Kong Gun, you know, roaring thunder Bagura! And then Luffy gets hit by that, and that was the thing. That was the moment where he awakened. And it's like, okay, well, what exactly was different from this time that Kaido hit Luffy compared to the last time Kaido knocked out Luffy, which, I remind you, wasn't that long ago. I mean, if we're just going with the timeline of One Piece right now, it was probably about an hour or so ago that Kaido knocked Luffy clear off of Onigashima, and he was, you know, that was the thing. Like, was Luffy knocked unconscious at that moment? And it's kind of like yes and no, because Oda definitely drew Luffy in that moment, like his eyes were whited out, and he is like the blank expression on his face. It looked like, you know, he was unconscious, but he was still able to communicate to Momonosuke and even the Heart Pirates, okay? And that's another thing I wrote down here is the voice of all things, and where does that exactly tie into all of this here, right? And also, one thing else while I'm on the subject of that, last chapter, chapter 1044, we had a lot of moments where various characters looked up to the roof, and they were like sensing Luffy's presence. You know, they thought he died, or probably he did die for a brief amount of time, and then his heart restarted, and then, you know, he woke back up again. And so everybody's looking up to the ceiling. Even Kaido is kind of looking a little bit like, okay, what's going on here? Even Kaido looked a little bit nervous about exactly what it was. Momonosuke looked really concerned. You know, there was a few other characters too, like Sanji. Sanji literally was like unconscious from his fight with Queen, and then he was being tended to by Some, and then he immediately was just like, oh, Luffy, what's going on up there, my captain? You know, and so, you know, then there was also Kid and Law that were there, Hyo, they all looked up Marco, and the implication was like, okay, is this like an observation hockey thing, or is this a voice of all things kind of thing, you know? Because a few chapters ago, we had the moment where Law was like, I don't sense, you know, Straw Hat's voice anymore, and it's just like a little bit confusing, because it's like, okay, can Law sense the voice of all things, or is this just like a standard observation hockey kind of situation, okay? And from last chapter, I'm going to assume it was more of an observation hockey kind of situation. Now, it really only affected the people that were like finely tuned to observation. Like, we know Sanji, that is his main haki that he's, like, the best at, okay? And so that would make sense that Sanji would be the one to, like, wake back up and, like, sense Luffy's presence. That doesn't mean Sanji can hear the voices of all things. It doesn't even mean Law can hear the voices of all things. The only canon characters that have been able to hear the voices were, Luffy, Momonosuke, Odin, Roger, maybe Law, because there was that scene at Zoe whenever Zunisho was, like, screaming, like, help me, please, somebody give me an order. There's a pirate that's shaped like a mammoth attacking me. This sucks. And then it was Momonosuke that was able to hear and also communicate with Zunisho. Meanwhile, Luffy was, like, holding his eardrums. They were about to burst, and he was like, all I could do is hear you. That's all I could do, You also had the scene with Law off to the side, and Law just had, like, the ellipses in his dialogue box or whatever. Like, could he hear Zunisha, or was he just not reacting to it? What was going on there with Law? We don't know. But in the last chapter, with Sanji and then Hyo and then Marco, I think it makes more sense that just those characters had really highly spec'd observation haki, so they were able to sense what was going on the roof. Same thing with Kaido, too. Kaido could sense it. I think the only person that had the voice that could really hear what was going on was Momonosuke. Everybody else just had really good observation, and they could sense what was happening on the roof, okay? But yeah, so that's the situation with the voices of all things. But yeah, so Luffy was able to communicate the first time he got knocked off of Onigashima, but this time was different. This time it really did seem like his voice just went silent, his heartbeat went silent, he straight up died, okay? So that leads to the idea that, like, maybe you do have to, in fact, die in order to go into your awakening. Because I went back and looked at all the other times throughout this story where Luffy has been pummeled into the dirt and possibly killed, and every time he comes very, very close, like a hair's breadth away from death. Right? Like, look at the time he scaled the Drum Rockies, right? And, almost died of frostbite there. By the way, I don't even know if this is a thing. This is another tangent. This is another point of the video. Now, the whole point of this video is a tangent, okay? But now that we know the true power of Luffy's fruit, the Hito Hito no Mi, model Nika, the sun god and all that. Now that we know that that is the main power of the fruit, and it allows the user to have the freedom to fight in whatever way they want, or maybe, like, their body is able to do any task, or the potential to do any task. Maybe that makes a little bit more sense on all these times Luffy was about to die, but was able to manage to stay away from it. Like how he scaled an entire, like, what was it? Like, 2-3 miles of sheer rock up on the Drum Rockies, and then he didn't die from that. By the way, dressed in, like, a vest, shorts, and sandals, and was able to survive that. Maybe that had something to do with it. When he fought against Crocodile, that was probably the first moment in the story where you're like, holy shit, is Luffy actually, like, dead? Where he got impaled by Crocodile's hook and then was, like, drained of his moisture and just thrown in the desert, right? So that's a thing there. That happened again in his second fight with Crocodile. I made a whole video about this years ago, about, like, Luffy's lifeline. Another major one was, of course, when he fought against Magellan and Impel Down. There's a few others in there, of course, when he was attacked by Akainu during Marineford. Akainu struck Jinbei, and remember, Jinbei also has a scar from that too. Jinbei took the brunt of that. All right, people seem to forget, that's how Luffy got his X scar on top of his, his chest and everything. Like, that's where that scar came from. But Akainu basically, like, reached down with his magma fist, impaled Jinbei and then grabbed Luffy. And so, yeah, that's where Luffy got the scar. But Jinbei also should have, like, a giant gaping wound scar, in the center of his body where, Akainu struck him and everything like that. So Luffy's been very, very close to death, but every single time there always seemed to be somebody around to kind of save him. In the case with the Drum Island, with his climb up, that might have actually killed him. Like, the frostbite and hypothermia might have killed him, but you had Dr. Kureha there who was able to save Luffy. I think the immediate method that she came up with, though, was just tossing Luffy into a hot bath, which, I'm not a doctor, but I'm just going to assume that maybe if you have severe frostbite on, like, most of your body and you have extreme hypothermia, is that the suggested medical treatment? Just draw a hot bath and just throw him in there. kind of seems like you would just die of shock immediately if that happened. It's sort of like when, at the beginning of the story, when Zoro was tied up at Shellstown. Now, this is a tangent. When Zoro was tied up in the courtyard at Shellstown by Helmeppo, and he was supposed to starve for, like, I think 30 days without any food. I think he only made it about 2 weeks or something like that. But after the fight was over with Morgan and everybody, they brought Zoro into town, and he was just, like, stuffing his face, just like, oh, nom, nom. Oh, man, guys, I haven't had anything to eat for, like, 2 weeks. Oh, nom, nom, man, this is great, thank you. Yeah, nom, nom. And I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure you would die of shock there, Zoro. But once again, it's One Piece. It's anime, manga logic, whatever. But anyway, yeah, Luffy made it to the top of Drum Island, and Kureha was there to save him, okay? And then during Alabasta, he was almost killed by, a crocodile, but then Robin showed up and saved him there. The second time, Luffy just got lucky. Just 100% he got lucky with the water falling on him. That was just perfect there. I guess, honestly, just think of it like in D&D terms. Luffy has been very close to death many, many times, but every time, he always manages to make his death save, okay? Luffy's been on death's door multiple times, but he's never quite dead. He's just unconscious, and even then, he could still exert his haki or his will a little bit. But the first time in the story Luffy did straight up die was when Kaido hit him with the Kanabo. So it brings up the question, what would have happened if Luffy did die and impel down, for example? Let's just say the poisoning of Magellan, Inazuma and Ivankov were not there to help Luffy, and Luffy just straight up died from the poison right then and there. Would Luffy have awoke? Would he have awakened his devil fruit powers and just like, I'm okay, Magellan, let's fight? And he's like fighting Magellan in his awakened form? Would it have been a situation like that? I don't think it would have been. And I don't think it would have been because you look at Luffy's gears. If you look at Luffy's gears, it's a progression of slowly reaching Gear 5th. Gear 5th is the amalgamation, the perfected form of all of Luffy's gears put together. Speed and agility of Gear 2nd, the, malleability, able to stretch and expand your body with Gear 4th, and Gear 3rd, and then Gear 4th is like the muscles, but it also has like the steam coming off of it. Gear 2nd did as well, but like the steam and like the ribbon coming off of him. So it's like all of the different aspects of his gears are put into Gear 5th, okay? So maybe Luffy did have to work his way up that ladder. So if Luffy was killed during his climb up to the top of the Drum Rockies, or if he was killed by Crocodile, or if he was killed by Magellan, that would have been it. That would have been the end of Luffy's journey right then and there. I was talking to, I believe it was Sensei about this, or maybe it was somebody else during the mini reverie we did, but we were talking about Yu Yu Hakusho, and like the idea that like, okay, Yusuke dies, early on in the story, like in the first chapter. That's kind of the premise of Yu Yu Hakusho. And then he turns into a ghost, and that, kicks off the story. But later on, way later during the chapter Black Saga, Yusuke dies again, but then he comes back as Raizen, as he's the Mazaku, the Mazako, or whatever it was called, right? Like the demon thing. And it was like, okay, he died once, but his strength, his spirit energy wasn't strong enough to handle it. So maybe look at it something like that with Luffy, where if he would have died earlier in the story, like if he drowned at Arlong Park back then, if Nojiko and Genzo weren't able to save him, and they didn't like pull his head out of the water, if he just drowned there, he would have just drowned, and he just died right then and there. That makes it a little bit better for me, at least, the idea that, if Luffy would have really died, that makes it better. But no, like, it's like Luffy is not the chosen one in the sense of, like, he ate the god fruit and he immediately received god powers, and, if he died, he would have awakened to them immediately. Luffy had to work for it, okay? And he reached the point there with Kaido where he was finally struck, and he did die. He finally failed all the death saving throws, or, Kaido dealt him, like, over max damage or whatever, and he just died outright. He was maybe dead for maybe a few seconds, maybe a minute or so, and then his heart like restarted, Oh, wait a second. I just thought of something. Luffy got killed, let's say, through blunt damage, Kaido hitting him with the Thunder Bagara. He also had, like, haki and everything like that, too. But it was, like, physical damage, like blunt damage. Boom! Pounded Luffy into the ground, and let's say he just died right there, okay? Let's just assume that, all right? What if Luffy's heart was destroyed? What if it wasn't just, the blunt damage that killed Luffy? What if it was something even, like, more extreme than that? Like, what if Luffy was, like, sliced in half? Let's say Kaido did not have a kanabo as his main weapon, but instead of a kanabo, he had, like, a giant, big-ass sword. Like a giant Final Fantasy, Cloud Strife, Squall. Oh, what was Squall's last name? It was something emo. It was Lionheart, right? It was like Squall Lionheart. Okay, I'm sorry. I like Final Fantasy VIII. I like Final Fantasy VIII. I'm just like Squall Lionheart. I mean, come on, that's all right. That kind of screams a little bit like middle schooler fan fiction, but okay, fine. Squall Lionheart, giant ass anime Final Fantasy Buster Sword, and instead of that attack, he used it and sliced Luffy in half. With like his heart and his brain just sliced in half. Like, would his heart have restarted? Because as I said in a previous video when I was talking about Luffy's awakening a few days ago, I was talking like, okay, Luffy, a lot of people are likening it to like, cartoon physics. And obviously that is the inspiration for these abilities that Luffy is utilizing right now. In fact, I feel like Oda probably went back and watched some old school cartoons, like with the rubber hose animation to really understand. Maybe Oda played Cuphead in preparation for depicting Gear 5th. Who knows? But Luffy does not have straight cartoon physics to the point where, like, if you take Bugs Bunny or if you take some cartoon character and you slice them in half with a knife or something, they can just be like, oh no, and then they just like, pop their halves back together and like they're just perfectly fine, like Dio did in Phantom Blood. Am I implying Dio Brando is a cartoon character? Well, hold on a second. I think that argument might be made. Hey, X-Forts, can you make a video about that? Like, is Dio a cartoon character? I don't know, there was that scene, Jonathan sliced him in half, and Dio was just like, oh no, whatever shall I do? If that shit happened in One Piece, like if that happened with Luffy, I'm just saying, where, I don't know, some character, probably not in Wano, but later on, like somebody pulls out a sword and slices Luffy in half, and Luffy's in Gear 5th, and he's just like, oh no, and then he just pops himself back together, I'd be like, okay, all right, that's going too far with it. I would not be a fan of that. We still don't know what's going to happen. We just saw the new ability in the last chapter. It's going to take a while to explain. So let's have a little bit of patience with this. If you want to decide, like, this is Oda just doing an ass pull and just throwing any ability that he wants into Luffy to make him, like, indestructible or invulnerable, I don't think it's going to be like that. Wait a while till we get the explanation. And then after we get the explanation, you can decide if, it really is an ass pull or if it's just, it makes sense, or if it's somewhere in between. It's a half-ass pull, so to speak, maybe. Who knows? But yeah, if Luffy did show that level of cartoon physics, I'd be like, that really would take me out of the story. Not even, like, being sliced in half to that degree, but if, like, Luffy, like, lost an arm or something, and he's like, oh no, my arm! And he just grabs his arm and just pastes it back together, like this is something like out of Toriko, or, like, Bleach or something with the hyper regeneration or something like that. Like, when Aizen, when Gin was like, kill him, Kamishini no Yari, and like boom, just like obliterates Aizen's heart and like his entire like chest, and then Aizen just glorped himself back together. Like, if Luffy's pulling that kind of shit, then yeah, no, let's not go down that direction with it. But in terms of the cartoony, like his eyes popping out of his head, lifting up the ground to use, like, turning it into rubber, inflating his body at will, like taking the aspects of all his gears and putting them together into one thing, I'm okay with that. I'm fine with that, but there is a limit, absolutely. But yeah, let me know down below exactly what would have happened if Luffy's heart would have been destroyed or sliced apart in some way. Now I'm thinking of the scene in Marineford when Luffy used Gumu Gumu no Scapegoat to throw, Buggy at Mihawk, and Mihawk, like, sliced him up like freaking finely cut salami, and then Buggy, because of his Bara Bara no Mi, was just able to stack himself back together. Like, what are you doing? Now I'm thinking about what Buggy's awakening could be, because the Bara Bara and Luffy's fruit, hey, wait a second. Okay, no. All right, if we can find out the Gumu Gumu no Mi is actually a mythical zone, screw it. Buggy's Bara Bara can be a mythical zone too. All right, why not, right? It's just like, what would Buggy's awakening could be? Because Buggy's fruit and Luffy's fruit do have comparisons. Like, you can make the comparisons between the two. They're not that different from each other, right? Buggy is immune from cutting damage. Luffy is immune to blunt damage. And so blunt damage can harm Buggy, and then vice versa, slicing for Luffy, okay? But the same basic premise applies. If Luffy's heart was destroyed, or if his head was cut off. Like, imagine back at Alabasta, after, Crocodile impaled him on the hook after their first fight. What if Crocodile decided, I don't want this, I want to make sure he's dead, and Crocodile took off his hook, and he had the knife underneath it. He just sliced off Luffy's head and just tossed his head into the sands of Alabasta right there. I don't think Luffy would be activating Gear 5th then. Okay, yeah, so he's not invulnerable, he's not invincible, and the only way he was able to activate Gear 5th is because he died after he had already kind of mastered Gear 4th, if that makes sense. I hope it does. Probably doesn't. The last thing I wrote down here is just what happens after. And I don't mean like story-wise going to like Elbaf or whatever. I mean like, would Luffy be able to activate Gear 5th after Wano whenever he desires, whenever he wants to? I would say sure, he would be able to, the same way that Kid and Law were able to go into their awakenings whenever. It's just that they had to acknowledge that these awakenings drain a lot of your stamina and they weaken you. Okay, and so they both admitted to that. Also, you have to understand that Kid and Law did not want each other to know their abilities because they are rivals at the end of the day. Yes, they are working together here to take down Big Mom, but it's like after this is over, they're going to be rivals. They're going to be enemies again, okay? And so I can maybe make more sense out of the whole situation when after they went into their awakenings, they're like, we only got one final attack with this, and then they use it. It's like, okay, well, we have another final attack. All right, so that was the final attack, but we could do one more, you know? That makes more sense because they did not want either of them to know what their final ultimate move was. Because when Law went into his awakening and he used his K-Room and he used his Shock Willy, I know it's not pronounced that, but it's just fun to say, Shock Willy, you know, that was apparently, like, Law was setting that up as his ultimate move. And it wasn't. We saw Law had stronger attacks afterwards. Same thing with Kid when he used a sign. A sign was not his strongest awakening move. Probably was the damned punk, like the gun thing. The rail gun that he made, right? So yeah, but if they did admit it takes a lot of stamina. It isn't just like a one and done kind of thing. With Luffy, I imagine it would follow the same basic logic. You know, he goes into his awakening. He's going to fight Kaido for the next few chapters. You know, like I'm thinking it's going to be the next 2 chapters before the break that we're going to get this fight. And in the context of One Piece, like the actual like amount of time, it could be like 2 chapters could be like, you know, 4 or 5 minutes in the actual context of the fight. If the chapters are just straight up fights, you know, if that's what we go with, right? And so Luffy immediately, like Gear 5th ends and he's just like, oh wow, that was really fun, but now I'm really tired. Chopper, help, Sanji, food, you know, like something like that, and he's just stuck like that. Luffy will realize, even if he doesn't know he has a mythical zone, even if he doesn't realize what his devil fruit is, he will realize that, like, oh man, this technique, Gear 5th, drains the crap out of me, right? And so Luffy's not an idiot. He's not the sharpest pencil in the drawer, but he's not an idiot, okay? He knows that Gear 4th, for instance, drained a lot of stamina, and it ate up a lot of his hockey. He's only able to have a hockey activated for like 10 minutes or whatever, and, you know, Gear 4th really blows through that. So he doesn't go into Gear 4th like willy-nilly. He doesn't just go into there whenever he wants and just be like, okay, I'm just going to use it for fun. He goes into Gear 4th when the situation, you know, warrants it, right? Okay, and so I think he would apply the same basic premise to Gear 5th. He knows Gear 5th drains him even more than Gear 4th does, and it's like, okay, I can use it whenever I want, but I have to be very, very careful when I use it. Something like that, right? Also, it puts Luffy in that, like, state of euphoria, which may very well be a detriment in battle. I mean, it's kind of funny and goofy to see him laughing and beating the crap out of Kaido in the last chapter, but it might be a situation where he might not be thinking as clearly, and Luffy never really thinks super clear. He's not a super tactical guy in battle, but you know what I mean? Like, he might let it go to his head a little bit. He might not be as focused as much. Maybe that might be a drawback. Then again, Luffy was laughing and on his ass, and, you know, like Kaido attacked him with Boro Breath, and he just got right back up and used the rubber wall thing, so I guess that's not going to be much of a problem. But, yeah, I think Luffy could go into Gear 5th pretty much whenever, but there's a consequence, like that detriment that involves that, and he'll be aware of that when this wears off finally. Okay, well, anyway, that's the video. I don't even know if that was a good video, if there was even a point there. I don't even know, but that was it. Anyway, let's head on over to Frog Facts. Why not?
Tekking. Frog Facts. Frog Facts. Frog Facts. Frog Facts.
Okay, so if you guys remember a few frog facts back, I talked about Wallace's frog, a frog that was named and discovered by Alfred Wallace, okay? That's how biologists rolled back in like the 19th century, okay? There was a bunch of them all over the place discovering new species. They had to like take out little sticky notes and like slap their names on the animals. Like, no, this is Wallace's frog. I discovered it. It's my frog, okay? So in that vein, today we're going to be talking about Darwin's frog, which of course was a frog discovered by Charles Darwin, and he named it Darwin's frog. Right? Wrong. Kind of. He did discover this frog. However, he was not the one that named it Darwin's frog. There was another biologist that came along and actually named it after Darwin later. And the name of this biologist, oh my god, names were so much cooler back in the day. This dude's name was Andre Marie Constant Dumeril. That sounds kind of like a drug or something. You know, it's like, oh, I have a headache. Give me some Dumeril. But no, it's just like Andre Marie Constant Dumeril. And I don't know how to pronounce that last name. But anyway, cool name, even if I can't pronounce it. Okay. He's the one that named the frog Darwin's frog in honor of Charles Darwin. But Darwin did actually discover it during one of his expeditions aboard the HMS Beagle. I think he had 3 expeditions on that ship in South America, which was around Chile and Argentina. I remember when I first learned about the stories of Darwin on the Beagle, and that's when he discovered a lot of like indigenous species of South America, the Galapagos Islands. He explored those and discovered the Galapagos penguins and stuff like that, which is the most northern species of penguin that exists. It's a really fascinating story. But I also love that story whenever I was in like history class back in like middle school or whatever. The teacher would say, well, Darwin actually had really bad seasickness, so he actually did not spend a lot of time on the boat. He would actually disembark and be like, hey, I have really bad seasickness. I'm just going to explore on land, and I'll meet you, I'll travel on land, and I'll just meet you up on this date in like a few months or whatever. And so that's what he would usually do. So most of the time was spent exploring on land. But I actually found an excerpt from Darwin's journal, and I have to read this because it's great. This is now we're doing tangents for frog facts. This is wonderful, but whatever. Anyway, this is an expert from Darwin's journal in January of 1832. All right. It is now the 5th of January, writing the memoranda of my misery for the last week. Because he's seasick. Okay, so dude, Darwin, as somebody that suffers from motion sickness really bad, I've never really been on a boat long enough to know if I suffer like, you know, prolonged seasickness, especially not like a wooden vessel back then that the HMS Beagle was that Darwin rode on. But dude, in terms of motion sickness, I've been there. If I'm in like in the back of a car and we're going down like a windy hill, like my stomach will be wrecked. And that's only for a few hours. I can't imagine what it must be like having motion sickness for weeks on end on an old sailing vessel back in the 1800s. So Darwin is just like this man. This is in his younger years, and he's discovering all these species, and he comes up, well, him and a few other, biologists at the time sort of are throwing out the idea of like natural selection, and maybe this is all connected. Darwin would go on to publish and write, The Origin of Species, which like created the theory of evolution. And here he is in his younger years, just like a wreck on this boat, like, oh God, this is the 3rd week of unrepentant absolute misery. Oh God. So I feel you, Darwin. I feel you. Anyway, back to Darwin's frog. It's a small frog. It's only about 2 to 3 centimeters in size. Its front feet are not webbed, but its back feet usually are. It is currently in endangered status. It's around Chile and Argentina, as I stated, so a lot of deforestation and stuff like that, destruction to its habitat are threatening it right now. It has pretty good camouflage. It can basically smoosh itself down and make it look like a dead leaf, so, predators can avoid it. But easily the most fascinating thing about the Darwin frog is that it eats its children. Yeah, but not like a cannibal, even though it is carnivorous, not a cannibal. No, this is what'll happen, okay? I want you to follow this here, okay? So the female of the species will lay the eggs, okay? And just a cluster like most frogs do. The male frog will guard the eggs. When the eggs begin to get a little active, when they begin to move around, like when they begin to develop a little bit, the male frog will devour them. He will swallow them whole, okay? Not just keeping them in his mouth. He will swallow them and keep the eggs inside of the vocal sacs, because frogs have the vocal sacs that can, like, inflate. So he'll, get them into the vocal sacs. They don't starve to death. Like, the male frog continues to hunt and eat food, like insects and everything, that go into its stomach and sustain itself. It's just that it also has its children inside of its vocal sacs, okay? And then they will remain in there for about 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The eggs will hatch. They will get into their tadpole stage. They will still be inside of the frog, and they will just subsist on the remains of the eggs and like the goo and things, I guess, inside of the frog. They'll just subsist on that. And then after about 6 weeks, the male frog will regurgitate the frogs that have already developed to the point where they can kind of hop around on their own. And that's Darwin's frog. Nature is weird. All right. Thanks for watching, everybody. Tekking signing out.